Right, just a little bit about me before I start. I'm a retired professional genealogist. I was doing this for 30 odd years professionally. I'm a fellow of the Society of Genealogists. I'm a fellow and a past chairman of AGRA, which is the professional body that represents professional genealogists in the UK. I currently serve as the vice chairman of the Family History Federation, where I'm also its education officer. I've written various books, but that's not that important. Hopefully what you're going to hear about tonight will benefit you, assuming that you have got back to sort of pre-parish registers, and we're looking at medieval records. And when you get back that far, you don't actually need to know how to do new research because your research techniques are exactly the same. What you do have to do is almost relearn some of the skills that you are going to need to employ to look at the records. So it's old records, new skills. And if you can read handwriting, if you can understand what a parchment document is and so on and so forth, you will be absolutely fine. If you're not, then as you get back that far, you will pick most of the research skills up. But interestingly enough, as far as the new skills are concerned, when you research before parish registers, you need to remember that things like births, parenthood, marriages, and deaths were not registered. There was nothing to register in. There was no parish registers, so you couldn't register baptisms, you couldn't register marriages, you couldn't register deaths, and so on and so forth. So what you're going to be doing is taking information from documents which were produced essentially for legal purposes. So they were produced by the monasteries, they were produced by the lawyers of the time, etc., etc. And because of that, and because of things that happened with persecutions and the dissolution of the monasteries and all those sort of things, the survival of records is sometimes patchy. So you have to piece together your information from a series of different records. And I'll explain that to you a little bit later on in the talk, when I've explained the sort of the new skills and the new terminology that you need to be able to understand. One of the biggest problems or challenges is that surnames are not always used, and they often change from one generation to the next. Standardized surnames didn't really come into existence until the late 1500s, and even then it was a little bit patchy. On a practical point of view, you will have difficulty in obtaining a copy of the records. So my suggestion to you is that if you have a smartphone or you have a digital camera, that you take that to a record office when you go and do your research and take a photograph of the document, rather than suggesting that you can take a photocopy or whatever. And because there's not a lot on the internet, this research is going to need to be done primarily in record offices and libraries. But there are some key points. Firstly, what is the medieval period? And I'll answer that in a minute or two. You will have to know where your ancestors lived, because all of the documentation, like everything else, is localized and of local base. It will be difficult for you to trace the female line, because even up until 1880s, when the Married Women's Property Act came in, women were not considered to be a legal entity. And that was very, very prevalent in the medieval period, particularly in things like manorial records. Women had no legality, so they weren't recorded in any great extent. Latin was the official language of most of these documents, but you don't have to be a Latin scholar. You don't have to understand Latin necessarily to be able to do your research, because if you arm yourself with a good Latin word list, Latin dictionary, then you can get through most of what we need to do. And again, all of that will become clear as we go through the actual talk. One of the things that is obvious is that the status and wealth of your ancestors makes a difference to what records they appear in. Doesn't mean to say that if you've got ordinary labourers that they don't appear in records. They certainly do. But there's a lot of, if you have somebody who's artisan, aristocratic or whatever and above, then there's a lot more records for people to appear in. But don't be put off by the fact that you've got agricultural labourers or, blacksmiths or whatever. They are equally well documented in medieval records. The other problem is that a lot of the records are highly abbreviated, and that's essentially part of writing in Latin. The contractions and the abbreviations and so on, are standard format in the Latin language. So therefore, your continuity cannot be guaranteed. In other words, if you've looked at parish registers or you've looked at census returns, you can go back through those registers, or you can go back to an earlier census return and find your family. What won't happen necessarily in medieval records is you being able to do that. You might have to relate, in one instance to a will, then you're going to look at a deed, then you're going to look at a manorial record, and so on and so forth to deduce the information. So it's a whole new sort of skills level, but it's, the rest of it is basically the same. So what's the medieval period? The medieval period is from around the year 1000 to about 1500, although it does overlap. And within that period, you have other time periods. So Anglo-Saxon, which they call early medieval, was up to 1066. And that, again, is obvious if you think about it. It's when William the Conqueror conquered the UK and the Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, ceased to be in existence, because what you then have is the Norman period, which again ran from 1066 to 1154. You then have the Plantagenet period from 1154 to 1485. You then have something called High Medieval, which overlaps with the Plantagenet period, and that's 1216 to 1398. Don't be too worried by the fact it overlaps, because these are essentially periods like regnal years. They're to do with king's reigns, they're to do with the way society was organised. And then late medieval is 1398 to 1485. Then you come into the Tudor period. So you're coming into the Henrys and the Elizabeths and so on and so forth between 1485 and 1603. So those periods, although it's useful to know, they're not necessarily essential for your research, other than perhaps the language, because in the Norman period and the Anglo-Saxon period, you are dealing with a language called Anglo-Norman as opposed to Latin and so on and so forth. But all of that will become clear as you go through your research. And because you're progressing backwards as you research, in other words, you're going from the most recent times to the earlier times, a lot of it will be more straightforward. You've also got to have an understanding of administrative geography. And most of these we're going to be familiar with. You're going to be familiar with the county, and the county doesn't really alter. In Latins, the county is known as a comitatus. And if you've looked at sort of posse comitatus, if you looked at sort of militia lists and things like this in the sort of 1800s, then you'll be familiar with the word comitatus. But all that means really is that it's a county-based set of documents rather than by parish or whatever. Within each county, you have, in the southern part of the UK, you have hundreds. In the northern parts of the UK, you have wapentakes. Exactly the same. They're an administrative area of local government, in effect. You then have parishes, which are no different to the parishes we have today, although you may be looking at something called a civil parish as opposed to an ecclesiastical parish. But very often, they are more or less the same in boundaries. Boroughs are ancient. Again, we know where the boroughs are, or burgus, They're normally by royal charter. They haven't altered. You know, the borough of Royal Tunbridge Wells is still the borough of Royal Tunbridge Wells, and it was like that when it was granted a charter in 1100 and so on and so forth. Village, again, is exactly the same. In some instances, you may come across something called a palatine or a palatinate area. And there are essentially 3 counties of Cheshire, Durham, and Lancashire that used palatinates as opposed to hundreds of parishes and boroughs. So the administrative area tends to be more county-based, but only in those 3 what I call modern counties. It started in 1351. Before that time, yes, you do have your villages, you do have your wapentakes, you do have your counties, and so on and so forth. So that's administrative geography. And again, it's important when you're looking at certain records to understand the breakdown or the hierarchy of the administrative areas. Doesn't affect your records as such, because you will still find the same information. It's just a matter of where you look to actually find it. So let's have a look a little bit more at the language. Let's have a look at Latin, medieval Latin, because Latin has been and still is the official language of medieval government. Latin didn't go off the face of the earth until the 1730s. But if you did Latin at school, then the type of Latin that is used for medieval government, for the records we're going to look at, is significantly different to the classical Latin that you would have been taught by your grammar school teacher or high school teacher when you're at school. Some of the pluralisms and that in Latin are the same, but not always. So, you know, you need to use the dictionaries that exist for Latin of the period. And if you're in a record office, most record offices will have Latin dictionaries, Anglo-Norman dictionaries, etc., on their open shelves for you to be able to refer to if necessary. The advantage of documents that are in medieval Latin is that many have been transcribed. So you can see English typescripts of what the document says. I'm not suggesting that you use only the typescripts. I think it's always useful to get the original document and have the transcription by the side of you as you tend to look at and read the document through, because that helps you to understand how the medieval language worked. But having transcriptions as well does away with a lot of the high abbreviations that exist in Latin, or it makes you familiar with what you're doing. You also have to contend with medieval English and Anglo-Norman. And before the late 14th century, very, very few documents were written in English. If any of you were around when the 900th exhibition of Doomsday existed, and you went to the Public Record Office that was then in Chancery Lane, they had an exhibition there where they had somebody in a hologram form speaking in medieval English, and you would not recognize it. It's nothing like the English we speak today. And one of the main difficulties is the variations in spelling, because people wrote what they heard, or they had particular phraseology within a locality that they would use. Not much different to dialect or accents today, but it is in, you know, an English language that we do not recognize, and they certainly don't string sentences together as we would do so today. Anglo-Norman is also reasonably common in medieval documents, slightly different to modern French, but if you have a knowledge of French, you will be able to very easily work out what the document says, because the French language has not changed like the English language has, you know, in that. So Anglo-Norman very often uses the phrases which modern France uses, and so on and so forth. But irrespective of that, if you do come unstuck, then use something called a Middle English Dictionary. And again, these are on open shelves in record offices. One of the other big challenges we have is handwriting and spelling. And this is nothing new. You know, we often have difficulty in reading Victorian census returns. So understanding handwriting, understanding spelling is nothing different when the further back in history you go. But when you're in the medieval period, when you're pre sort of 1550, there were 7 different medieval styles of handwriting. And again, as you become experienced and as you become familiar with it, it won't be too much of a problem. The only problem really is that very often the documents are illegible or faded or have bleed through. They're heavily abbreviated, but that's usually denoted by a line either above the word or below the word. If it's a line through the word, then it literally means crossed out. But if it's above or below, you know it's an abbreviated phrase or word within the document, and you've got to think about what additional letters are missing. Spelling is irregular, but again, we're not that unfamiliar with it. Spelling is irregular as you get back into the sort of the early 1800s anyway, because people wrote down what they heard. And there were some confusing letters, just as there are in later paleography. The confusing letters in the medieval period were L's, M, N, V, C, T, E, R, and B. And you're probably wondering, and I haven't got time to sort of show you the variations, you're probably wondering how those can all be confusing letters, because no way does an M look like a B unless you see it written in such a way. The significant spelling variations of names of persons and locations also affects what you can do. And I'll show you some examples. I'll work through some examples with you in a minute on how you can see, how these things change. But to understand and be able to read the records, I would recommend that you go on to the National Archives website and have a go at their paleography lessons and their beginners Latin lessons, particularly if you've never done anything or you're not that confident with reading old handwriting. All of their lessons, there's about 10 or 12 in each section. All of them start with the very easy and they work through to the more complicated. You can read it, you can type in what you think, you can push a submit button, and then it shows you, the mistakes you've made or where you've done something wrong or whatever. Just go on to the National Archives website and just type in paleography or beginners Latin, and you will get up the courses, which you can do at your own time. They're not assessed. You can do them at your own time. You can see exactly what there is, how to do it. It's idiot proof, it's interactive, and it does help you significantly to read the documentation, because the examples you're transcribing or reading are actual documents that have been found in the National Archives for both paleography and beginners Latin. Extremely useful to do. Even if you think you understand handwriting, just go and do it, because the further back you go, the less likelihood you are of being able to understand what is going on. But let's come back and have a look at personal names. So, there are a large number of spelling variants. You can have Chambers, you can have Chamber, you can have Chambray, Deschamera, etc., depending on which language you're using. So if you're using Anglo-Norman or using medieval English, the word Chambers is going to be written in such in a different way. And very often, with a little bit of common sense approach, you can understand what the word is trying to tell you. Surnames only became hereditary for all levels of society in the early 14th century. And even then, it wasn't always the same. So persons could be described in more ways than one. So Robert Lascombe of Northampton could be Robert Northampton, he could be Robert of Northampton, he could be Robert the Mercer of Northampton, which includes an occupation, and so on and so forth. So he's not always going to be recorded as Robert Lascombe. In fact, to have a surname is a valuable asset that is not always prevalent. First names, again, as you work back in time and as you become familiar with the records through history back to the medieval period, you're going to know that Johannes or William or Ricardus stand for John, Richard, William, whatever. They're fairly standard, and they haven't been any different, since the medieval period. But again, if you're in a record office looking at a document and you don't quite understand it, go and look at the Record Interpreter, which again is a book on open shelves, and that includes lists of Latinized common first names. So, it's not hard to be able to work out whether you're looking at Richard or whether you're looking at John or whatever. Surnames are slightly different, because to specifically identify individuals, King William I introduced the use of surnames. And you have various types. So you have the paternal names, which is the name of their father. So John, son of Richard, becomes Johnson. Little bit patronymic in some ways, but that's how surnames originated. A lot of people were named after the place that they lived in or were born in or whatever. So some people adopted the names of their place, like John of Lewis became John Lewis. Topographical names, reference to a geographical feature. John, who lived at the ford, in other words, the river crossing, becomes John Atford. And occupation names as well, which are probably more common these days. John the Cooper, who made barrels, later became John Cooper. So people were known by the occupation they followed, which is why in some instances within the same family, you will find that the surname changes from generation. Because if somebody, for example, was a blacksmith, John was a blacksmith, he would be known as John Black. If John was a silversmith, he would be known as John Silver, and things like that. People also took their surnames from the offices that they held. And this is particularly true in manorial records. So, if they held an office within a manor, then Robert, who was the Reeve, became Robert Reeve or Robert Reeves. Add to that the nicknames. Somebody of appearance, Richard by the Water became Richard Walter. Richard Redhead or Ginger Nut became Richard Ginger, and so on and so forth. So names will give you a clue in many respects as to what you need to look at and where you need to look to find information in the earlier records, because they took their surnames from any of those, from the place name, from the topographical name, occupation name, and so on and so forth. And all of those are clues as to how you research. Place names are slightly different, because if we look at, for example, Nottingham, then in various documents, Nottingham has become Stottingham, Snottingham, Snotton, Nottingham, etc. And again, it's very often, if you're in a geographic area, it's usually fairly easy to work out that, Snottingham and Nottingham are the same place. They're just apart in the number of years within the documents. But then place names have also changed over time. Parva for little, for example. So if you're in Leicestershire, if you're looking at Glen Parva, or you're looking at, whatever, then you can work out whether it's the little part of the village or the great part of the village, and so on and so forth. A lot of them derive from Latin. But again, there's a reference guide that you can use called the English Place Name Society. And there are about 4 volumes of books that tell you the names of places in history. So if you're living in, as I do, live in Luton, I can go and look at the English Place Name Society under Luton, and I can find out the whole history of the names of the town and when they happened, and so on and so forth. So again, use the books on open pages in the record offices or the libraries. Date systems in documents also vary, and that depends upon the type of document you're looking at and how it was original, what its original purpose was. but exact dates didn't begin to appear on documents until the 13th century. And you have various types of dating. So you have regnal years, which are the years of the monarch's reign. You have the AD system, which is the one we're familiar with. It's the Julian calendar, the Gregorian calendar. You have records that are dated by saints' days. And believe it or not, there's a saint's day for every single day of the year. You have exchequer years. And the exchequer years in the period we're talking about were the 30th of September, the 29th of September. Whereas today, our tax year is the 5th to the 6th of April. So, you know, it changed. I'm not sure what time when it changed, but it's not that important. Papal years, again, very similar to regnal years. It's through the reigns of the Catholic popes. And then you have episcopal years, which are the recognized church years. Those dating systems will appear on specific records. So if it's a record generated by the Crown, it will be dated using regnal years. If it's a record generated by the Catholic Church, it will be in papal years. If it's a record generated by the Treasury or the Exchequer, then it will be by exchequer years. And you just got to understand what is going on. And on the internet today, there are various sites that will enable you to convert between old and new style dates. Will show you the years of the reigns of the various monarchs, and you can even extend that out, because the first year of the reign of Henry I will be the 10th of June 1100, because that's when he ascended to the throne, and so on and so forth. So, you know, all years don't begin on the 1st of January. And indeed, before 1752, years began on the 25th of March anyway. So you have this changeover. But as I say, there's a lot of finding aids. There's a lot of conversion aids on the internet that will enable you to convert old to new style dates of various things and show you, you know, as that shows you a list of regnal years, you can get your list of papal years, exchequer years, and so on and so forth. I don't know how many of you have stared at a parish clock and tried to read Roman numerals that exist underneath with the M's and the D's and the L's and the X's and the ones and so on and so forth. But we didn't use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as a numbering system until fairly late on. So again, the medieval period requires you to use Roman numerals. So if you don't understand Roman numerals, then again, go on the internet and have a look, because is the I before the X, is the I after the X? What's it mean? You know, where does the 50 come in connection to 100 and so on and so forth? So you've got to understand the procedure for working out the years. And most documents, irrespective of what dating system they use, will use Roman numerals for anything else. So, you know, if you're looking at an old will or an old inventory and it says something is worth 4p, you will find that there are 4 I's rather than a 1 before a V, and so on and so forth. Just depends how the document was written.